Welcome to the International Economics course. I am Dr. William Schlosser, and we are using the textbook International Economics 15th edition by Dr. Robert Carbaugh. As we start taking a closer look at the first chapter of the International Economics textbook, I challenge you to think like an economist. I would advise you to approach the topics discussed with an open mind, which implies in a big way putting in check acceptance of traditional concepts and perceptions.
We've been doing a lot. We've had a lot of interactions with dignitaries from India. We just had the Dalai Lama here a couple of weeks ago, and we're going to have Sri Ravi Shankar, who is a very prominent guru who has many millions of followers here, and we're talking about Indian issues in particular of late. Sadanand Dume is our resident scholar in Indian studies, and he has a question about that country.
I can hold this. Thank you very much. I have a broad question about India. When you look at your engagement with the country, what do you think it's done well, and where do you think it needs to do the most work?
Well, India has a lot of very socialistic policies having to do with labor and land, and the fact that it has not risen as a manufacturing power is an indictment of its government policies. That is, as China's incomes went up, the place that the world should have moved to next as the manufacturing hub of the world absolutely should be India. And that's only happening to a very tiny extent. And it has to do with, regulatory complexities, infrastructure quality. Now, I'm optimistic about India. We put more into India than any country in the world.
The chapter introduces you to the international economy and a concept of globalization. The first part of the chapter emphasizes a high degree of economic interdependence that characterizes today's economies in the world. Economic interdependence, the way we witness it now in this world of unprecedented technological and communication advancements, relies on the long history of international exchanges among nations.
Globalization is a widely discussed topic. It is therefore not all that easy to explain such a complicated term in simple words. Let's start from the beginning with the background to globalization. Advances in technology, such as mobile phones, aeroplanes, telephones, and the Internet, have made the growth of transport and communication networks possible. Amongst other things, this means that people and countries can exchange information and goods more quickly and in a less complicated way. This process is called globalization. Globalization comes from globe and means the worldwide coming together of countries and nations. Let's look at an example. Companies used to manufacture products in their home countries, just like the companies Profi TV and Supercolor, who produce televisions in country A. Their products are in direct competition with each other, but both companies pay the same salaries and production costs. They have the same customers, use similar suppliers, and sell televisions at similar prices. In short, the same conditions apply to both companies. So far, so good. Due to technical, cultural, and economic developments that have come about through globalization, other companies which manufacture products under different conditions can now offer their products in country A too. That's why a company from country B can sell televisions here at a lower price because they were produced for less. The local firms Supercolor and Profi TV have to react to withstand the competition. And so the world grows closer together, and there is an active exchange of goods between countries. More affordable products are available for more people. However, not only does an exchange of products and economic goods take place, but also of services, knowledge, cultural goods, and even languages. All of these individual elements are closely linked and influence each other. But where there is light, there is also shadow. Because of globalization and this intense exchange of goods, people and the environment often suffer. If a company decides to move production to an economically disadvantaged country, people in industrialized countries lose their jobs. At the same time, job opportunities open up to many locals in the economically disadvantaged country. Many people in these countries work for very little money in comparison to those in industrialized countries. Therefore, they often remain poor and more often than not do not have sufficient insurance, social insurance, or health insurance cover. A further disadvantage of globalization is ecological problems such as climate change. The use of aeroplanes, ships, and lorries to transport goods over international borders is constantly on the increase. This causes more carbon dioxide to be released into the atmosphere, which, in turn, is the main cause of global warming. Even national environmental standards are ignored. This is a further cost factor in the worldwide international site competition, which should be kept as low as possible to be attractive for a company. There are therefore many sides to globalization which affect almost all aspects of life, causing me to think that the chain of positive and negative effects will continue to grow further. What's important is to realize that globalization itself is neither good nor bad. It just depends how people deal with all the new possibilities in the future.
Economies of the world have initiated, grown, and matured in relation to their nearest neighbors as a result of political policies and social interactions between people. Since time immemorial, tribal governments of North America developed trading relationships with their nearest neighbors to exchange goods. The current United States economy initially developed as a colony of the British government, and for the last 300 years was shaped by its closeness to neighboring countries of Canada and Mexico. It is interesting to look back into history, tracing the evolution of the world's economic order being shaped by changes of each nation's political order. Industrial progress and growing population have most contributed to the multiplying effects of globalization tendencies in the world. These processes eventually created a high level of complexity in the web of economic transnational life, resulting in a growing number of open economies at the global level. The U.S. economy is described as extremely open, fastly trading goods and services with its neighbors, and more distantly located countries around the world. The economic linkages between nations reflect intergovernmental policies used to encourage and discourage specific activities. Some of these activities are mutually advantageous between trading partners with specialization and economic efficiencies, while others are protectionist in nature, designed to shelter local industries from foreign competition. Some critics view the current global economic system as a strategy to keep developing nations in poverty. As we progress through this course, look for indications of who benefits and who loses from trading relationships. Think like an economist. Globalization refers to an internationally interconnected network of economic systems. It is an integration process of an international scale, arising from the interchange of worldviews, products, ideas, and other aspects of culture. It is culturally and economically dynamic, the dynamics of the process accelerating in the last several decades. Continuously advancing transportation and telecommunications infrastructure, including the rise of the telegraph and the development of the Internet, served as major underwriters of globalization. From the economic development point of view, globalization happens when country A produces a good that country B wants, country B purchases it, and country A sells it. An economic exchange is made and globalization starts. Fast forwarding to today's multinational economic marketplace, we see four critical elements within international flows of exchange: goods and services, capital and investments, movement of people across borders, and exchanges in knowledge and culture. Some of this has led to global environmental concerns associated with industrial activities locally and in faraway regions. What are the drivers of globalization? As human nature does not change in its basics, So businesses' everlasting thirst for profit can be described as a leading underlying force for building new connections. Technology, communication, and transportation means do the rest to contribute to the current intensification of material and virtual links that humanity is responsible for. However, out of the mentioned four elements of globalization becoming more and more liberalized, labor movement across the world still remains the least deregulated exchange flow in international markets. Financial exchanges can instantaneously happen from points around the globe in financial markets and business production floors. Today's technology gives people the ability to lessen the challenges of distance, but it also brings with it certain disadvantages. Everything comes at a price. Comfort of an easy data exchange shadowed by security concerns. Archaic globalization is a term used conventionally to describe how nearest neighbor trading expanded to include regional trading partners and sector relationships between communities and states, and how they historically created the basis for an ever geographically broader perimeter for spread of ideas and social norms at local, regional, and global levels. By the end of the 19th century, government policies and technological advances combined to create a fertile ground for the exchange of goods and services across international borders. During this time, the globalization catalysts were the U.S. and European business people, aided by steamships to cross oceans and railroads to move goods past shoreline cities. Exporting from countries with competitive advantage for key goods created rapidly expanding economies with increased employment, favorable returns on investment, and swelling political influence. Participation in globalization rewarded countries on a massive scale. This was all brought to a halt in 1914 by World War I. European governmental restructuring following the war and economic redevelopment of countries located around the ring of the Atlantic caused economies to deflate. Scarce goods of one country that had found export markets in another country were barely traded. Governments implemented socially favored protectionist policies to buy local in an effort to support domestic workers and industries. In the 1930s, the Great Depression culminated as companies collapsed and economies buckled. The financial crisis started in the U.S. and spread throughout Europe. Then came World War II, lasting from 1939 to 1945, as wartime participants threw their entire economic, industrial, and scientific capabilities into the war effort, erasing the distinction between civilian and military resources. Global economies, with 2 world wars and a global economic depression, retreated into nationalistic political responses. Economies shrank, unemployment swelled, and the benefits of globalization were again sought. 2 consecutive world wars brought technological advancements such as air flight, diesel-powered ships, road infrastructure developments, and workforces seeking gainful employment. So the economic problems exacerbated by limits of nationalistic policies forced a new agenda completely, with the ultimate goal of setting the stage for a higher level in international trade in the flow of manufactured goods. Governments responded by implementing trade liberalization policies by lifting the protectionist trade barriers established during the first half of the century. Developed countries in Europe and the U.S. were the first to enjoy the benefits of integrating local economies through exchanges with trading partners. Soon, Asian, Middle Eastern, and African countries joined in the wave of globalization. Trading exchanges targeted agriculture and primary goods from developing countries, providing them with revenue. But the exchange of manufactured goods between nations still faced stiff barriers to free trade, a relic of protectionist policies. By the middle of the 20th century, Europe and the USA had gone through significant changes due to 2 world wars, decimating most of Europe and bolstering U.S. manufacturing in the shape of big corporations. As trade between developed countries increased, cores of specialization emerged within communities, regions, and nations. Agglomeration economies, integrated through clusters of economic activity, gained productivity as they specialized more efficiently in both manufacturing and distribution functions. Firms taking advantage by building virtual linkages became more successful due to decreased costs and competitive advantage, acting as cluster members. Here we can talk more about economic and social inequality, which became very obvious. While developed countries propelled themselves forward in manufacturing industries like automotive, aircraft, shipping, and energy production, reaping all the benefits of economic growth and technological advancement, the developing countries were pushed outside this core of success. A number of factors, both external and internal, contributed to their economic and technological isolation. Trade barriers still existed within and between these countries, firmly establishing their dependence on agriculture and other primary resource commodities. While many developing countries relied on revenue from the export of food to the developed nations, the Third World was not a participant in high-technology industries. The latest wave of globalization began in about 1980, as several developing countries, bigger in size and population, used the revenues they generated to develop low-technology and labor-intensive manufacturing industries to make a leap forward in the international trade arena. Utilizing their experience and reputation combined with abundant, low-cost labor to build value-added commodities that rich nations would buy, they moved up. They liberalized internal trade barriers to encourage foreign investments, competitive advantage in labor-intensive industries, low tariffs to foreign investment, and technological advancements allowed these countries to grow economically and expand the scope of their globalization effort. Since 1980, we have observed obvious trends of the latest wave of globalization, the one we are experiencing currently. The developed nations, which have been exposed to international trade exchanges for a considerably longer stretch of time, are more involved in the flow of capital and investments. Conversely, less globalized nations, which are considered less developed economically and socially, have mostly experienced labor outflows to locations where workers can find paying jobs. Foreign outsourcing has broadened a network of low-cost manufacturing locations in countries with cheap and abundant labor for component production and assembly. In the process, new markets were opened by capital-rich corporations, allowing them to avoid certain tariffs and increase their profits. This resulted in job losses for the countries active in outsourcing their production and service functions, creating benefits of employment for others. We can look at an example from Hewlett-Packard to illustrate the concept of how transnational firms operate. Computer component manufacturing at Hewlett-Packard has found low-cost solutions by identifying the combination of providers from 8 countries, building parts for about 95% of their laptops. HP is not alone in this strategy, as other laptop producers reach nearly 100% in the outsourcing effort. This kind of interconnection between production units requires a high level of labor organization, coordination in all steps of business operations on the one hand, and on the other, this allows the firms to maximize their profits.
Hewlett-Packard's turnaround efforts seem to be working. This is What's News on WSJ Live. I'm Joanne Poe. Despite posting weaker sales again, Hewlett-Packard swings to a profit and beats Wall Street's modest expectations, sending shares of the computer maker higher Wednesday. The company seeing increased sales of corporate computers, but revenue fell in each of its other units. CEO Meg Whitman says that she is pleased with HP's progress, but the company still has a lot of work to do. Ms. Whitman says HP needs to make its products more competitive, boost investment in research and development, as well as improve execution.
Such levels of interdependence are made possible today through digitization, the internet, and high-speed data networks available around the world. Location and distance matter less today than at any time in history. Some countries formerly left behind the curve have invested in educational and technological advancements to make their low-cost labor competitive on a global scale. Outsourcing has become a game changer for developing countries as well as developing countries that have been involved in globalized economic efforts. Highly technological industries have built a cadre of skilled employees through university training programs and practical experience in technologically advanced workplaces. Developing countries with a low-cost workforce and advanced educational programs have been able to provide upscale manufacturing services, giving multinational companies an economic advantage. This advantage translates to offshore jobs in developing countries and lower commodity cost to the people of the host company. Companies embracing this tactic have seen specific costs lowered by up to 50%. Within less than a century, the U.S. has covered the road from an isolated and well-protected economy to one of the most open in the world. This rapid transformation, like any significant change on such a huge scale, given the size of the country, brought with it benefits and challenges at the same time. We will discuss those later in this course in a lot more detail. Open economies have economic activities between the domestic nation and outside nations. People and businesses can trade in goods and services with other people and businesses in the international community, and funds can flow as investments cross borders. Some nations are very open, such as the United States, while other nations are closed economies, like North Korea. Most countries are between the extremes. A way to measure the openness of a country takes into account the value of exports plus the value of imports, divided by the gross domestic product of the nation. This gives a comparative measure of the country's overall reliance on international trade. The size of a country's economic activities influences its degree of openness. Larger countries are able to achieve self-sufficiency for basic commodities, while also developing efficient manufacturing centers and self-sustaining populations. On the other hand, smaller countries, in economic robustness terms, tend to have a higher relative rate of openness because of their reliance on imports and exports as a ratio of their GDP. A cursory look at the relative rates of openness shows how international trade in the Netherlands is a large component of their nation's economy, while it is a comparatively smaller factor in the economies of Japan and the United States.
It's the home of great artists and slightly creepy statues.
The Dutch are also grand masters when it comes to trade and logistics. Ooh.
You can see that here at Flora Holland, the world's largest flower auction, right next to Schiphol Airport with its 6 runways. Here they trade 12.5 billion blooms every year.
So here we've got a load of amaryllis. I'm told this whole trolley load is worth 800 or 900 euros.
Suppliers supply and buyers buy every 4 seconds.
All the trades are based on this massive clock which represents €1, and where the red dot stops is the price per flower. So those ones have just sold for 76 cents a flower.
And believe it or not, the busiest time of year isn't just Valentine's Day.
March 8th, that's the International Women's Day, is also very important for us because mainly in Russia, that's the day where every woman in Russia gets a flower from her husband or friend, whatever.
It's all very nice if you don't have a problem with flying flowers in from Africa, then flying them somewhere else. But it doesn't involve any massive ships. Welcome to Rotterdam. We're on patrol in Europe's biggest port, all 40 kilometres of it. 30,000 ships and 100,000 barges pass through here every year. It's not got great weather, but it's got a great location.
Rotterdam is situated at a point where the River Rhine flows into the North Sea, and that location, a part of Europe that's heavy populated and industrialized, makes it a perfect spot for a port.
It makes the Netherlands the EU's 3rd largest exporter, even though its population is tiny. But Eurosceptics talk of the Rotterdam effect. The theory is that lots of Britain's goods go through here on their way to the rest of the world, but statistically that counts as trade with Europe, and so the benefits of our EU membership are exaggerated.
Here's something else the Dutch are good at, reclaiming land from the sea. 3 years ago, this was underwater. 1.5 billion euros and millions of tons of sand later, it's the newest part of the port.
Gradually, it will be filled up with new infrastructure, enough to make the Netherlands dominant on the high seas for another century.
The history of the U.S. in terms of its rise to today's level of involvement in the world economy is well described in the textbook. So here we'll briefly state that a combination of unprecedented industrial and technological advances and political astuteness of the country's leadership in the second half of the 20th century allowed the U.S. to make a bold leap from protectionist policies to openness, placing it into a leading position in the global economy. The degree of openness in an economy is only a static measure, not reflecting the real dynamics of economic changes through time. In the U.S. economy, domestic policies and international events have shaped our involvement in international trade. Here are some numbers demonstrating two important aspects of economic openness: labor mobility and capital mobility. Labor mobility is responsive to the degree of a nation's economic openness. In the USA, at the start of the 20th century, foreign-born population constituted about 14%. Domestic policies curtailed immigration for much of the first half of the century. Current policy liberalization for immigration has brought the share of foreign population and workforce members to the rates they were a century ago.
Hi, Ken Roberts, President of World City. Welcome to this episode of Trade Matters. Today we're going to look at the top 10 U.S. trade partners. The February trade data is just out from the U.S. Census Bureau. I've spent a few minutes looking at it and I have some interesting stories to tell you about that. First, the good news is U.S. trade is up for the first time. After 2 years of trade being down, for the first 2 months of this year, trade is up almost 6.5%. On the export side, it's up about 6.8%. On the import side, it's up about 6.2%. That means the U.S. trade deficit, which is always large and always under discussion, has gone down a little bit, about 5.5%. So that's good news. So let's look at those top trade partners. The first three are China, Canada, and Mexico, and they account for a good 40+% of all U.S. trade. They're the big players in this game. They did quite well, but again, not as well as U.S. overall. The next seven are going to be: number 4 is Japan, number 5 is Germany, 6 is South Korea, 7 is United Kingdom, number 8 is France, number 9 is India, one of the fastest growing U.S. trade partners, and number 10 is Taiwan. So what's going on with China? Well, U.S. exports to China are up more than 22%. Imports are up 1%, slightly over 1%. Who's the big player in that? Chicago is showing big, robust growth, up more than 10%. Savannah is up about 6%. Big exports that are up: soybeans are up more than 18%. Motor vehicles and aircraft are up more than 35% each. Let's take a quick look at Canada. Canada's growth is about 5.5% through the first 2 months of the year. A big piece of that's going to be related to energy. So that's oil imports are up 53%, petroleum and gas are up 47.5%, and gasoline, refined petroleum, up 35%. Mexico now. Mexico's trade is, again, a lot of energy stuff going on there as well. Gas exports to Mexico are up more than 80%. Imports of motor vehicles are up 16.25%. Commercial vehicles are up 11.3%. You can read about those countries and all other countries, as well as custom districts and ports, top exports and top imports at ustradenumbers.com. Lots of interactive maps, charts, graphs, lots of great information. And remember, trade matters.
Capital mobility is also indicative of a nation's economy. For the last 50 years, the movement of capital in the form of foreign direct investments and foreign ownership of U.S. financial assets has been on the rise. This has resulted from three factors: economic stability as compared to the rest of the world, growth potential, and diversity of investment horizons. At the same time, U.S. consumers have increased demand and purchases of foreign-produced goods, making us a global net goods importer and financial borrower. Capital and investment flows in the interconnected global financial markets require a robust system of international banking. The international banking system is embraced by virtually all trading nations. This has become a requisite for international businesses to conduct financial exchanges and operating activities in dozens of countries continuously. The day begins in Tokyo, then travels with the sun through Asia, Africa, Europe, to the Americas, then starts again as the sun traverses the Pacific to wake up traders in Wellington, New Zealand. Within this international financial network, U.S. commercial banking has expanded dramatically over the last 50 years, placing associate banking authorities around the world for currency exchange, loans, and debt servicing in business interactions of multinational companies. Within the U.S., over 250 foreign banks have set up similar services. Together, the sea of banking interests provide 24/7 global operations. Globalization has taken the attention of businesses and governments around the world. It is a process used by businesses to make products and provide services at a significantly lower cost. As they exceed local demand for their goods, products are shipped to consumers in neighboring countries and around the world. Producers in other nations may provide other goods and other services at a lower cost than domestic producers do. When this happens, imports and exports flow from producers to consumers and economies grow. Here we need to talk about the concept of relative or comparative advantage as one of our major business principles. Comparative advantage expresses an economic process of finding where it makes more economic sense to produce a product or service, domestically or offshore. Because of bigger number of players in the international market and factors of competition between them, driven by innovations and higher production efficiencies, enhancements to factors of comparative advantage are found. At the beginning of this lecture, I suggested that you be critical of what you see and hear. Analyze it to understand who benefits from certain arrangements and who loses. International trade has erased borders between countries in a certain sense and has brought additional factors into play. It takes a lot more knowledge and awareness to create most favorable combination of these factors when making economic decisions. Consumers are generally the biggest benefactors of free trade, seen as lower costs for high-quality commodities. People who lose in these arrangements are the domestic workers in those industries that have lost comparative advantage against producers in other countries. This happened in the textile industry, where in the 20th century, significant trading countries included the European Union, the United States, Canada, and Japan. Globalization caused fabric manufacturing to be largely outsourced to overseas labor markets for reduced cost reasons. By the late 1980s, U.S. domestic textile manufacture was no longer price competitive. Industry integration and global manufacturing led to many firms moving production facilities from developed nations to developing countries. We will frequently revisit the topics of comparative and relative advantage as we discuss various topics in international economics. Make sure you give this concept your full attention. In the previous section, we explored open economies as the consideration of international trade exposure along a sliding scale of very open to very closed. Currently, there are no absolutely closed economies. However, the degree of openness becomes more of a decisive factor for the success of any international business. Since we are all consumers, the benefits of international trade are seen in our daily lives in terms of the purchasing power of our income. Costs to the consumer are lowered because of international cost competitiveness. From the point of view of manufacturers, global competition means seeking continuous improvements with an emphasis on product innovation, improvement, and cost competitiveness. The rate of economic growth in a country is driven by success of businesses to generate profits from domestic and international consumers. As companies flourish, the nation's economy expands. Economically successful countries enable trade, implement effective higher education programs, and build integrated communication systems. A tool we'll explore in greater detail in chapters 2 and 4 is a government's use of tariffs to restrict foreign competition against domestic producers. This chart shows a negative relationship between high tariff rates and the economic growth of nations. Most businesses are challenged to maintain profitable operations and growth at sustainable rates. Globalization of industries means that competition often extends beyond local markets or national-level competition to face worldwide challenges. Competition also implies that if there are successful businesses, there are also less successful businesses, or those who will exit the economy completely. In the course textbook, a few examples describe how the first innovators captured global market dominance, but were not able to successfully predict the importance of changing technologies or consumer tastes. In the first two examples, global competition from Asian companies due to innovative techniques led to product quality enhancements, allowing them to meet rapidly evolving consumer preferences. In the case of televisions, U.S. producers were the first in the market, but lost industry dominance to Asian competitors who combined low-cost labor, technologically advanced design, and lightweight products that captured global market dominance. By the turn of the century, there were no TVs produced in the U.S., but now there is one that entered the market with a mid-range cost and mid-range performance LCD TV.
We all think we know what globalization looks like. We all also think we know what global trade looks like, and what has been a huge expansion over centuries, from the days of the pioneers who opened up the world to cross-border commerce, to today's vast container ships crisscrossing oceans around the clock.
But the world is changing rapidly around us, and so too are the shapes of globalization and trade. Think about the future of both these days.
And you quickly realize that trade is already starting to look a lot less like this, and much more like this. That is a reflection of both how our lives have become more digital, and how, armed with our smartphones and an open mind, we can travel the world without leaving our own living rooms. The British economist John Maynard Keynes famously offered a vision of infinite possibilities to the consumer. On the eve of the First World War, he wrote, "The inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth, in such quantity as he might see fit, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep."
And since then, we've moved a lot further. These days, anything an inhabitant in London or Washington or Beijing might want is available via an app on his or her phone. Money can be shifted across borders with a few clicks and swipes. Raw materials can be ordered with an email. Trade financing for widgets from far-off factories can be ordered via the cloud.
The odd thing is that even as we recognize how much our lives have changed, we rarely think about how trade has been shifting with it. For decades, the trade in goods around the world, which is now worth more than $18 trillion each year, grew at twice the rate of the global economy in what some called the era of hyperglobalization. But that has changed since the 2008 financial crisis. For several years now, trade has been growing at the same rate or even slower than the global economy. Some of that is clearly cyclical and due to the economic scars left by the global crisis. But some economists also argue that a big component of that slowdown has been structural, either because of China's growing role in global supply chains and because increasingly those supply chains are more Chinese than global, or because more of what we do and trade is related to services. That takes many different forms, from lawyers to architects to accountants to global musical phenomena. We are, many futurologists tell us, at the beginning of another wave of innovation that is going to upend global trade patterns yet again. 3D printing has the potential to short-circuit long international supply chains.
This could be different. The pioneers of 3D printing are making it possible for us to order goods on our phones or on our tablets, and for us to manufacture them in our own homes. The changes could be profound. Think localization rather than globalization. Sean Donnan, Financial Times, Washington.
We are bombarded weekly by news stories and political opinions based on the pros and cons resulting from international trade. Some people are made better off because of open trade effects, while others suffer economically. As you participate in discussions on these topics, arm yourself with the advantage of economic knowledge so that you can contribute to a conversation based on understanding cause and effect realities and sound principles of economic trade-offs. You may have participated in discussions founded on these examples, and hopefully your contributions in the future will be based on discerning perceptions about economic realities in our markets and world markets. Filter out emotions and false assumptions to concentrate on the facts of the situation.
The following is a Cairo 7 Eyewitness News special presentation.
They are unforgettable, perhaps unforgivable images. As the world watches, demonstrators determined to disrupt the World Trade Organization smash windows, crash downtown, and clash with police. The sound of anarchy. The smell of tear gas.
It is incredibly painful.
And the incredible sight of Seattle under siege. 4 days that changed the way the world looks at Seattle. 4 days that changed the way we look at our city.
No violence, no gas.
4 days that changed the way we look at world trade. Tonight, a Cairo 7 special report. 4 days in Seattle.
As you consider your perceptions in economic terms, think through an idea of trade regulations for a public bad. It puts a different spin on the topic of trade when we talk about the exchange of bananas versus cigarettes. The same perception could be applied to the trade of commercial jetliners versus military bombers. Consider who is made better off and who is made worse off. These discussions generally include personal opinions about what is right and what is wrong. Everyone in every country works to make a living, whether directly as an employee or business owner, or indirectly as a member of a family or community cooperating in order to live. In U.S. markets, consumers of goods benefit from competitive trade because of increased consumer utility at reduced prices. Domestic workers in industries not able to rival foreign competitors are harmed when they lose their jobs. This has been repeated through waves of globalization, and the response of many has been to limit foreign competition in an effort to protect domestic workers. Workers from around the globe are intertwined through their integration in markets for commodities and services. Consumers engage in price competition for lumber, grains, vegetables, just as consumers do in Austin, Texas, Sapporo, Japan, or Dublin, Ireland. Global price competition leads to downstream effects that intensify worker productivity and compensation to level the playing field between countries. This is often explained as a factor of comparative advantage between companies, regions, and nations. Manufacturers best suited to producing certain merchandise at the best price capture the greatest global market share. Employees of these leading companies gain job security and increased compensation, and if labor becomes scarce in their employment zone, compensation can increase further. Global competition establishes a cost point struggle as manufacturers in other countries enter the market with differentiated products at a competitive price. Their capture of market share may be fast or slow, but this process establishes more consumer choices at a competitive cost. Trade barriers are partisan tools wielded by politicians to protect domestic workers from foreign competition. Data show that in the long run, domestic employment is not improved by protectionist policies. They lead to an inefficient allocation of resources and reduced domestic competition through isolation from the international market competition. International trade has been a game changer for all businesses, foreign and domestic.
I sometimes describe myself as a culturally conflicted Englishman. I am first generation born in the UK. I was educated at the French Lycée in London for 13 years. I spent a lot of my childhood in Italy and 30 years as an international lawyer. And I've always been fascinated by cultural differences. But I think it was arriving in New York as a 21-year-old student that I got my first taste of the oxymoron I'd like to share with you today. Global village. Not global village in the way brilliantly described by Marshall McLuhan when he predicted the internet in the 1960s, but more as a word that we use, an expression we use a lot now. My New York experience was not momentous, but it left a huge effect on me. I spent my first day walking the streets in awe. The word awesome had not yet become fashionable. And at the end of the day, I decided to take a cab to have dinner with some family friends. I knew about cabs. I'd taken cabs in London. And so I got into the cab, and in my very English, polite, maybe apologetic way, I said to the cab driver, "Good afternoon. Do you think you could possibly take me to?" And I read him the address on the piece of paper. He looked around. His eyes had gone funny at this stage. His brain was clearly working overtime. His answer was unforgettable. "Sonny, do you want to go or don't you want to go?" Well, of course, at this stage, I was confused because I did want to go, because I was expected for dinner. But I thought for many days and many hours about that encounter. Rude, confused. Was it me? Was it him? And it made me realize for the first time how very different we all are and how differently we communicate. That "Sonny, do you want to go or don't you want to go?" was followed by many other examples during my career as a young and not so young lawyer. I remember as a very young lawyer negotiating with the Japanese. And I went back to the office very proud. "They agreed to everything I said." And my boss looked at me and said, "Peter, are you sure?" "Oh, yes." They kept on saying yes. And he explained to me, of course, that yes meant that they had heard me, not that they agreed. I realized with my Dutch and my German and some of my American clients that directness doesn't necessarily mean rudeness, a bit like my cab driver in New York. And I also, of course, learned that the English really do talk in a code that nobody understands.
Some people and industries benefit from globalization, while others do not. Proponents see the advantages that competition ushers into industries for technological progress, global growth, price competition, and product differentiation. For consumers, global markets through free trade translate into more choices at competitive costs. Countries, both big and small, have mostly benefited from globalization to improve their standards of living. Critics of globalization recognize that multinational firms are the biggest winners of free trade at the cost of workers who make the products. The claim of unfair competition from cheap foreign labor catches the attention of our domestic workforce as images of sweatshops and child labor abuses are visualized. A predictable reaction for the consumer is to shy away from the products produced in this way. Competitive markets show how consumer choice blends in-product quality and cost results together as goods are purchased. Equal playing field arguments consider domestic employment laws and environmental regulations against the policies of other nations, in order to understand that the costs of production and social compliance are not equal between nations. The advantages and disadvantages of globalization will keep being discussed, but the value judgment of its appropriateness and utility is left up to you, the budding economist. We have briefly covered in this video the process of globalization, its history, and its advancing grip on the economies of the world. The logic of human interaction throughout centuries has brought us to where we are today, as economic and social human entities. There is no turning back.